Thanks for joining our Oracle Digital Assistant webcast series. I'm Jürgen Kress, member of the Oracle Product Management team. Today's webcast is the fifth in a series to create better enterprise chatbots. The webcast is live and on-demand recordings are available. For details, please see our newsletter and subscribe to our video hub. In today's presentation, Daniel Teixeira and Frank Nymphius will give us tips how to build better digital assistants. Good afternoon, Daniel.
Good afternoon, Jürgen.
Good afternoon, Frank.
Hi, Jürgen.
So what did you prepare today for us?
Well, so we talk about something, I think a better term to put it is that we are leaving ground now. So we are kind of starting out into a little bit of development work where we're going beyond into artificial intelligence and machine learning and going straight into integrating with backend systems. So I think pretty exciting topic today.
So a digital assistant project is also a lot of integration work to get the data.
As always, at the end of the day, a digital assistant is a front end.
Wonderful. So let's get started. We also have Arti with us. Arti is our team member extension, and you can ask the digital assistant any question about our enterprise chatbot. You find Arti at the documentation page. Please go to bit.ly/ODA documentation, and in the lower right corner, you find the icon. Quick housekeeping, please feel free to post your questions via the conference Q&A tool or Twitter #PassCommunity. At the end of the webcast, we will answer them. Slides will be available at our Video Hub channel and also via the community website. Please share your feedback via the Zoom survey at the end of the webcast. Today's webcast is recorded and will be published at Oracle Video Hub. The webcast is a series of 6 webcasts. Number 1, 2, 3, and 4 are available on demand on the registration page and on Oracle Video Hub, and we will conclude the series on November 22nd. With that short introduction, Daniel, what's the agenda for today's call?
So that's pretty much what you have here. I think Frank will start with a little introduction to set the scene, give a little overview on backend connectivity. I will show a little bit of the new REST component, and then again pass the ball back to Frank, where we'll cover custom components, entity event handlers, and best practices as well.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're located and watching. Well, we introduced the topic, which is best practice for backend integration, which is just another term to just cover the whole thing. So we try not to leave anyone behind. So we want to make sure that everyone gets the most out of this. And we do have an agenda, and that's kind of the train that we will follow. So at the end, we will summarize a little bit of best practice and then open up for a discussion, Q&A, whatever questions you have. So let's start with the overview of backend integration. Well, first of all, a digital assistant that doesn't have any backend integration probably is not of a lot of use. Yeah, and you would think, hey, wait, Frank, frequently asked question. They are answer intense, so they don't have a backend integration. And I would say, yes, you're right, but you're wrong at the same time, because the thing is that within a digital assistant, you typically have in-domain questions, which mostly your bot is trying to answer, but you also have out-of-domain questions that would come in, like who's the president of the USA? Now, you could say that, well, I don't understand, but what is that for an impression that you give? So here, and we covered that several times in various webinars, you would say, okay, you know what? If the bot is not made to answer the question, who's the president of the USA, or why is Liverpool not top of the league, then why not asking the internet? And here you go. So that's another reason to reach out to a backend, when that's the biggest backend we know, which is the internet. And of course, through the course of this webinar, you will learn that our backend integration, mainly when it comes to what the developers do, is through a REST service. But that doesn't mean that you cannot have other intermediary layers in between, like Oracle Integration Cloud, Oracle Process Automation, or the Oracle Relational Data Services, the REST data services that you have in the database. So whatever you have should come in between if it makes sense. So with this said, so let's have a look at the picture. When we talk about backend integration from Oracle Digital Assistant, what does it really cover? So first of all, and Daniel mentioned that there is a new component, which is called the REST component, and it's little bit more than a component. It's like the OAuth component that we use for security that actually will have an authentication or a configuration screen for the REST services. And then the component itself would just have a named reference to this configuration, which is, as I said, a little bit more than just a component, and Daniel will cover that. So this component is built-in components. That means you're not writing any code for that. It's a purely declarative configuration, and whatever the REST service returns, it will save up in a variable. And then this is where in a dialog flow, you will start working with the variable. And even if this fails, if the REST call hits an error or a failure, then even that information will be available to you in a variable. So when would you use that? Well, you would use this from within the dialog flow. We covered dialog flow during the last session, and the dialog flow is more like the scripting of the whole conversation that you have between the digital assistant and the user. And wherever it makes sense, you would drop that component to make a REST call, either to read, write, or whatever you want to do with it. My recommendation is for you to use this as a preferred choice because it's a no-code solution. Of course, every out-of-the-box solution has its limits, where then you would go and look for something else. But one of the limitations, for instance, here is a single REST call at a time. So if you have 2 or 3 REST calls that you need to do and then do something with the 3 payloads that you get, then probably that component is not the right thing to use. And this is why we have another solution, which is a custom component. Now, the custom component is something that you develop using Node.js. And for this, and I will cover that later, there is an SDK that we provide. So you're not dealing with the raw payloads. That would be asking too much. So for the conversation between your component and the bot, we would have an SDK that will invoke functions and you just respond to those functions. You develop that in an external IDE, whatever your favorite JavaScript IDE is. And then there is a choice of deployment that we provide with one deployment that comes within Oracle Digital Assistant, and I will cover that later. So when would you use this type of integration? Well, you would use this again if there's a REST call that you need to do out of the dialog flow. And if you joined us for the dialog flow talk that we had last session, then you know that we have subflows. We can have multiple flows in the Visual Flow Designer. So it may even make sense to think about having a custom component created in its own flow and then use that flow for the REST call parameterized in a single flow. Yeah, so you're reusing it more to say. So there's a lot of flexibility that we add in Oracle Digital Assistant since we have the Visual Flow Editor and in combination with custom components. Custom components can handle as many REST calls as you want within one component. I wouldn't say that sky's the limit, but common sense definitely is the limit. It allows you to do some post-processing on the REST response, say that you want to just extract some information or you just want to compute a response out of the 3 calls or 4 calls that you make. Plus, it gives you the ability to have an OCI integration. If you think about where would I put passwords, if I need to put credentials, then OCI Vault would come into mind. Yeah, so kind of putting it away safely. So that would be the custom component. Both, and this is why they are all on the top level, are dialog flow integrated. The third option are entity event handler. Entity event handler, again, are custom components. And this is why I need to make sure that we understand custom components. On the right upper side are dialog flow custom components. And these are custom components in the context of a composite back entity. You develop them with Node.js, but you do have a choice of development IDE, either an external IDE, or you can build this within Oracle Digital Assistant in the browser. We will cover that later on. So the way that entity event handler work is that they are involved in, or actually consulted in the process of resolving a composite back entity. If you joined us, I think it's 4 or 5 weeks back when we talked about entities. There we talked about composite back entity and define them as real-world objects, like you're building a car out of a seat, a security belt, a wheel, and so on. And this is what composite back entities are. And while the composite back entity is kind of doing its job, this entity event handler gets called. And in this context, you can, of course, do a REST call. So when would you use it? Well, I already said it. When you're in the context of composite back entity. And while we were talking about entities, and last time when we talked about dialog flow, I brought up the term of model-driven conversations or entity-driven conversation, which is where you have the composite back entity just prompting the user until the real-world object is fulfilled, and then you can do something with it. So that's like model-driven conversation. And for this, if you need to integrate REST calls there, you would use entity event handler. So, and then we have other. So other, that would include SQL dialog, which is NLP to SQL tooling that we have out of the box. You would mostly use this for analytic questions, like what were my top 5 sales in 2022? Then we have human agent support. That is what we have for quite some time. That will allow you to escalate a stuck conversation. Yeah, so a user is unhappy or the bot doesn't know how to handle the user, and then you want to hand off to a human agent. And the benefit still that you get out of this passing on to the human agent is that the human agent or your support line would have a decrease of calls because the bot will handle what it can and only then pass it onwards. So we would have like the bot as the first layer of defense, yeah, if you exaggerate a bit. And then there is knowledge search, where we can use Oracle Knowledge Search to query documents. We have Intelligent Advisor when it comes to doing some sort of questionnaire kind of things. Of course, and I mentioned that, OAuth for security, for authenticating the user. And then we have a web view component. This web view component is what either you can have a single document application that you build with Oracle Jet that will give you a structured data input form, or you might have an existing web application that you want to integrate within the Oracle Digital Assistant conversation for maybe people start off asking for a new subscription for a service, and then they would have to fill in a form, and that form could be pulled from an existing web application if you have that. So this is also backend integration. Now, when you would use this, you would use this for your integration needs when the need for the integration fits to one of these topics that I put in here. And I hope that I didn't forget anything here. But you can see from this picture, from this final picture here, that backend integration is big in Oracle Digital Assistant. What we will do now in the remaining of this session is we want to talk about the 3 areas, which is REST component, the custom component, and we'll talk about entity event handler in more detail, and will help you hopefully or enable you to use REST services from within your Oracle Digital Assistant. So with this, I would pass it on to Daniel to cover the first part.
Built-in REST service components. So this is the latest addition to our capabilities. And as you could see from the circular graph that Frank was just showing, it's just one of the many options we have for backend connectivity, right? This one in particular stands out, because it allows us to call a REST endpoint, directly from the dialog flow in a low-code fashion, right? There's no need to code anything. There's no. I think the last topic in this session is about best practices, and they're going to look at the sweet spots for each of these backend capabilities. Suffice to say that this one in particular works particularly well for single and simple REST calls. Now, the first thing we need to do is to actually configure all of those REST APIs in ODA. So we have a new menu under settings that is called API services. And the first step is to actually define and configure those APIs there. Only after that, we'll be able to actually invoke them from the dialog flow. And we have a lot, again, all of this is low code. We are just configuring the API. And as with any API, there's a lot of things. Does it need authentication? Yes or no? If yes, which type of authentication? Do we want to pass it as a header, as a parameter? Which methods do we want to support? So all those typical things that we need to have, the information we need to have when we're actually defining the specifications or implementing what the specifications are for that particular API. All of that is done here in the settings, and we are able to configure all of that. I'm going to show a little demo of this so you guys can see, but that's step number one, always doing that pre-configuration so that we then are able to invoke those APIs. And on top of that, it does allow you to define all those parameters. You may have different API specifications. You have APIs that are query-based. Others have, path-based parameters. You are able to define both of these APIs here. And one of the things you need to do here, and I'm going to show this as well, is that you actually need to test, right? You need to test if your configuration is all is okay. You test the request to confirm all the settings are correct, and you get the response, and that's after which then you are able to bring this evocation from the dialog flow. Two side notes important. So you can also mock the response, right? So you can save the response you get here as a static response. This is particularly useful, if you are testing the dialog flow or testing the chatbot, so that you're not dependent on the availability of that particular API, right? So you are also able to mock the response to have a static response that you can define here. And last but not least, this is a suggestion on best practices. Try out the API, in Postman or a similar tool upfront, so that when you come here, you are really confident and comfortable with all the different configurations that the API may have. Sometimes, especially for posts methods, you may have a body. You need to be sure that all those configuration pieces are working. You can obviously try it out here, but it's way easier if you already have it running in Postman. That's a good example, or you can try out things up front. Now, as I mentioned, this is step number one: configure all the REST APIs you want on this API service settings. After which, within the dialog flow, when you're adding a state within the service integration, you have the call REST service template. This is the template that will expose all of these pre-configured APIs. And what you can see here on the right side, it's the palette for that particular state. And the first thing you'll do, and again, I'll also show this, you're going to choose the REST service you want to call. Again, this state allows for single REST call. So you choose the REST service you want, you choose the post method you want, you choose the method you want, whether it's get or post, and this will preload with the default, with the configuration from the service setting. Obviously, you can overwrite that, but it preloads the endpoint and authentication. If it's already there, it's preloaded with that to sort of help you configure the palette. If you look a little bit to the bottom, you see here the response mode, where you can actually use the REST API response, so a live response, but you can also choose to use the static one. Yeah, I'm also going to show this. And the last part we need to do is we need to create a variable, because we need a variable to hold to the response of our request. After that, it's normal dialog flow business where you can do what you want with that variable. But in just one state template, we are able to fetch data from the backend. Now, let me just bring my ODAs. Let's see if this is still logged in. I think so. So let me just show you then settings, API services. I have already some configured here, but we're going to use throughout this webinar one particular API, which is the currency converter. This is a free currency conversion API. And you can see here, this is already predefined here, but we can walk through the settings here. We need to have a base endpoint. We can choose the authentication. This one takes an API key, but you can see some of the other things, basic authentication, bearer token, OCI, resource principal as well. You can choose how you want the API to be sent. Is a query parameter. You can choose to, as a header, all of those different things that allow you to configure your API. In this particular case, I only have a get, but you can add other methods as well. If you need to have a body, choose the content type, and so on. So this is where you're going about to configure your API. So just for you to know, this particular API has a base endpoint and has two query parameters. There's a query parameter. And again, this is a currency conversion. It takes a country code from to. This is how we pass the information to the API, and there's another field which is optional, but I have it here, which is to send just a compact response instead of a lengthy response. For your APIs, you do all of this here, and then, as I mentioned also before, you need to test the request. And only after this is a successful status, you're able to save this if you want, but you're able to use this API going forward. So this is already pre-configured. I just want to show you another one I have here that shows a different type of APIs. This one here. So some APIs use the path, and you can use these placeholders to define that, right? Some APIs don't take the query parameters. They actually use them in the actual resource path, and you can use these placeholders that you can define then here, and it should be a different type. Instead of type query, will be type path. Again, depending on the type of APIs you have, you are able to configure them here. Once you do that, I'm going to bring a skill just to show this working. So I have here a skill that, let me bring the dialog flow. Again, it's not very important to look to the dialog flow. What this skill does, it takes the currency we want to convert, and it will, this is just a mock-up, this is empty. So I'm going to add the REST state template here. What this will do, will just check the currencies it wants to convert, will invoke the REST service, and will just present the output. And I have a placeholder there. So this is what the actual dialog flow is doing. Send just an output message. This is the part we want to replace. And then the output will store it as a variable and just present it to the user. Very, very simplistic approach, but I just want to show you how will this work. So service integration, call a REST service. Just going to insert this here. I'm going to delete this to do because we don't need it anymore. There we go. So this is the default palette. Again, it's empty because we do need to choose the REST services. I'm going to choose the one I just mentioned, currency converter. So as I also mentioned before, it does preload with the defaults in this API key and the endpoint. And now I only have one method. So there's nobody here. So at this point, what you need to do is just, to map the parameters. That's what you need to do, right? So this one doesn't have any headers. So we have two parameters. One was the queue, and I have here an Apache free marker. And again, it's not very important to be, to show the details of this. What you need to do here, you need to pass that information into this parameter, and then you choose if it's query or path, and that's what it's doing here. This is simple mapping, right? You're mapping the data you have to the input of the REST service. And the last second parameter was the formats, which was optional, but I will have it here as well. Okay, so keep scrolling down, and we have the options here to, again, use the real API, or if you are just testing, you can just use a static, or even having a fallback. So if the API call fails, to use the static response, which is a pretty cool ability as well. Now, the last thing is you need to have a variable to hold the response, right? I already have a variable here, but you could as well create it. It's an output variable of type map. And again, without going into the details of this dialog flow, what it's doing here, it's picking up the output variable, setting it, and just displaying it in the output. So if I go back to our previous execution, which failed halfway through it, if I just re-execute this, all going well, there we go. So and you can see here from the dialog flow exactly what it did. Calls the REST service, sets the variable, and just outputs the variable towards the user. And again, it was a very simplistic approach because, of course, you can have a failed call. So you need, in a realistic scenario, you need to define the transitions where you define success paths and failure paths to be able to manage this properly. But again, the idea here was just to show how you can very easily invoke REST services from the dialog flow, which is, there's a lot of use cases where this really proves to be very useful. Back to you, Frank.
Let's go back to the slides. So as I mentioned, what Daniel just showed, that's probably my recommended go-to solution for backend integration when it's integrated within a dialog flow, because as you could see, this is purely declarative. Once you have it configured, it's just there and fills in the variable, and you only have to read out the variable. So now the topics that we're covering now are more like for a little bit of developer fun, I would say. But with complexity, typically there comes a lot of control and power, and that's what we're handling here now. So let's start with custom components. Now, last time I talked about dialog flows, and part of that talk was what is a flow state. Now, a flow state we knew is mapped to a component, and the component is doing some important thing like interacting with the user or saving a variable value or doing some logical operations. And we have two types of components that we can use. One is the set of built-in components, so we're no longer really exposing components to you, because in the visual flow designer we expose state templates, and they're more use case driven. So as I mentioned last time, we're more focusing now on the what you want to do than on the how you do it, right? But then we also support custom components, and now the custom components is where you create the equivalent of what the built-in component is doing. Every state has properties, and the properties is kind of a hint of what possible component type is behind, because the properties come from the component, and you use this to configure it to influence behavior, like card layouts. You want to have this horizontal layout or a vertical layout, or the UI even. Yeah, so everything that the component exposes can be set through properties declaratively, and then most important, at the end of the component processing, there happens something, and usually what happens is a transition. Now, if there's no specific transition, then it will follow the next transition, which is a pure static configuration on what's the next dialog flow state to go to. Or you can have conditional navigation through action strings that return. If you take a state like a switch state that we have, now the switch states will look into a variable or into an expression, and each of the possible outcomes of this evaluation could be mapped to another flow. Yeah, and this would be then action strings returned by the component, which, however, you would only declaratively map in the transitions tab of the state component palette. So this is what components do. And as I mentioned, one component type is the custom component. I also said that the custom component is developed with Node.js and JavaScript. In theory, yes, you can also build them in Java if you want, because they just execute as remote services. However, we have an SDK for JavaScript and Node.js, and given the popularity of this language, I think it makes sense then to stick with JavaScript and Node.js for that. Custom components are like built-in components. They're just custom, which means that you control the behavior, you control the properties that you want to expose, you manage the state. So if a user clicks a button that you render out of your custom component, then you handle that. You put the meaning to what it means when someone presses a button. And the component, as the built-in component, may return action strings. And this will then tell you or actually tell the dialog flow designer or developer where to navigate to next. And well, it's optional, and I put it here last, is like it may render user interface. Now, custom components, there's no rule that it has to render UI. So mostly it could be like you configure it through properties, it makes a call to a REST service, it gets some values back, it saves it in a variable, done deal. Yeah, so no need for rendering a UI. Now it could return a success flow in case that everything went good. Then you know that, okay, the variable holds the result data, or it will return a failure transition in case that the remote service is not available, or it can even have an unauthorized transition just in case that the access to the remote server failed due to the lack of permission that the user has. And then the dialog flow designer would make sense out of this. So this is what your custom component will cover. I mentioned the SDK. Now the SDK is available on GitHub, and it's used for many purposes. And you would see me pointing out to the same SDK when I talk about entity event handlers. I put the URL of this SDK on the right bottom. So it's github.com and then Oracle and /botsnode SDK. Now, it will be installed through the Node package manager. So you need to have Node and Node package manager installed on your machine, and then you can simply do npm install, and then it's at Oracle botsnode SDK. And this contains all of the functions to interact with the bot calling into your custom component. And that includes variables defined in the flow. You have access to properties or parameters that are passed in with a call. You have the ability to return a string response or a message response, or even render a rich UI. So everything is possible through this SDK, and you don't have to deal with any sort of payload. It's everything done behind the scenes. So very straightforward to use. And I will show you a sample later on. So this slide I put together to save you some time reading. It's all in the documentation, so you're not missing a thing if this slide wouldn't be there. But I think this slide really shows nicely what the process is. First of all, you install Node and npm, and then you install Oracle botsnode SDK. So you would do it with a -G, so it's get a global installation. If you're on a Mac or Unix machine, you would have to execute this as a sudo command, so sudo npm install. And once you have this set, then you can start building the custom component project. I typically start with npm init on a folder that I want to become the parent folder, and npm init -y saves me a lot of questions. It would just take the component name, same as the folder name, and that's it. And the next step already is to call botsnode SDK init, which will configure everything relevant to the component, everything that the project needs to run the custom component. It also generates a sample component, which is a typical Hello World component that I will show you next on the slide. There is a little bit a variation of this command that you can see here, like botsnode SDK init component name Hello World. This is if you want to start your project with a custom name for the component that it generates, yeah, which makes sense if you just use this component as a starter. You can, beside of using JavaScript, also develop with TypeScript. In this case, you would initiate the project with -- language TypeScript. And the development itself, as I mentioned, is an external IDE that you use, and you use whatever you want, what you prefer, what's your favorite JavaScript IDE is. When you're done with developing the custom component, then there's another call, which is botsnode SDK pack, and this will create a deployable file. And then with this, you can go to any of the deployable options that I will introduce later on as the choice of deployments. You can also run it because the component project contains an Express server. So you can just call botsnode SDK service, in which case you can launch a browser /components will then list all of the components that a custom component service contains. And if you start looking into building custom components, then you will learn that custom components are a big REST service that has two methods, a get and a post method. The get method is used by the browser then to show what the components are, and the post is what the bot will use to pass information into your custom component. And one custom component service can host as many components as you want. So if you have an existing project, so if you want to start it with a project, then of course you want to add more and more components, and there are commands for this as well. So you can use bots node init component and then the name of the component, and you flag it as custom to indicate that you're creating a custom component. And then you can also have a subdirectory. So if you have components with a meaning, like we typically have components that are utility components, we have components that are related to the use case, and it makes sense to put them into a subdirectory. So you can do this, and there's an example for a query order component, which is saved in the orders subdirectory. So here's the famous Hello World, and I think every product should have one. So we have ours too. And so what I want to call out here is, first of all, there is a description of the component. Now, this description of the component will define the parameters that you expose to the dialog flow. And the dialog flow designer will use these parameters to pass values in. Yeah, and one of the best practices is not to make any assumptions. So in your custom component, if you need to get access to a variable in a flow, don't make an assumption that a specific variable with a specific name exists. Have the dialog flow designer passing either the name of the variable in to your custom component or its value, so that you work with that. So use this really as a contract between you, the custom component developer, and the flow designer. You see, I have here two actions defined, weekdays and weekends. So I can go through a different navigation road based on whether it's a weekday or a weekend. For a weekend, I could say, stop working, you're supposed to be off. And then what the custom component really calls is this invoke function. And you can see, if you're a little bit familiar with JavaScript, it's an asynchronous invocation. And then you have an option. So I have a property defined as human, which could also be like a name. And if you define it like this, then whatever the dialog flow designer will pass in as a value to this property, you read into this constant in this case here. And then in the end, it replies, in this case, a welcome message. This is probably why it's called Hello World. And it will return then the transition out of it. So that's a very simple example, but I think it makes the point. The context that is constantly used in the context of properties, context of reply, the context is the SDK. Yeah, so we could have called it SDK, but I think that would have been too simple. So we called it context because it's a context that comes with the information that the bot sends to the custom component. So it's not just the functionality or function to call, it's also giving you access to various things like request object and so on. And the documentation is full of good examples for that. If you are already familiar with Oracle Digital Assistant, or if you just join a team and you look at their custom components, you might see a signature like the one shown here on the slide. So this is a non-asynchronous call. So this is a call with a callback handler, and the callback handler is done. So this is still supported as we're backward compatible, but it's just legacy. It's old. It's yeah, we support it. But if you build new custom components, we recommend that you use the new way of doing things, and that's also what the bots node SDK would generate for you. So the skeleton it generates will have the new signature and not this signature. But this still works. It's just the difference is that at the end of your processing, you will have to call done, which is a function call, just done with brackets on it, and then it will return to the bot. Whereas with the asynchronous call, you just return and that's it. So how do you call REST from this? Long introduction into custom components. Now we need to think about what is the best way to call a REST service. Well, the good news is you don't code the REST service call yourself. You use an existing module. So the Node.js ecosystem is full of examples on how to call REST services. There's one that is part of the Node core library, which is called HTTPS. Then there is a very commonly used one, which is called Axios. And then there is Node Fetch. And typically all of these except for the HTTPS you install through npm install and just the name of it. Now, node fetch is what we recommend you use. And the reason we recommend this is because it's part of the bots node SDK. So there's no additional import that you need to do, no installation that you need to do. It's just there. You can look up the node fetch documentation and it works one-to-one within Oracle Visual Assistant. However, if your favorite REST module is Axios or something else, feel free to install it and use it instead. But the recommendation is just also for the sake of consistency, because you could use node fetch with custom components, and as we'll later see with entity event handler as well, our recommendation is to use node fetch. So let's go to my little code snippet that I have here. First of all, the import of the node fetch library, that's automatically there. So that's auto-generated when you generate the template. And fetch, in this case, is the handle to the node fetch functionality. So what I have here, I have then request URL that in this case, again, the currency converter that Daniel introduced. So it's the converter base URL, which I read from a skill parameter. So I will get it passed as a parameter. Then I have the query string where the base currency will be passed from the dialog flow. Same for the target currency. I just compose that URL. And then in the end, what I do is I just say await fetch. So fetch, just to remind you, fetch is the handle to node fetch. And then you pass the URL and along with the method. If that was a post call, you probably would have additional parameters to pass, the payload that you want to send, as well as the headers that you want to send. The await is just a way to synchronize promises. Now, promises is in JavaScript the way to have asynchronously executed code. So with await, it means that the REST call is waited to be finished before the next line, which is the response, is called. So the REST call.json function will then turn the JSON response in. So how do you add a custom component to a dialog flow? Again, that's purely simple. As soon as you register the custom component, I will show you later when we talk about the deployment choices, how you do this. Then all that you do is you just go to your flow, you choose the add state, and then enter service integration, which Daniel showed when he worked with the REST component. You choose a custom component that adds a custom component state, and all you do is select the registered custom component name. It will immediately show you the properties or the parameters that that component exposes, and you just map it to some sort of values that you have, be they static values or in this screenshot, values that come through Apache FreeMarker expressions. So let's have a look at my version of the currency converter. So switching to my browser, and at any time, if you don't see what I see, let me know, but you should see my browser. This is the dialog flow that I have. So I have resolve composite back state, and then I have the custom component. So if I click on the custom component, then what you see is that, first of all, I have a general setting. So this is a name that I give this to the state, but then here I have a select list where I choose the registered component by its name. And then the component itself has properties. One is for the amount, one is for the API key that, as Daniel has it, I have to pass to it. And as you can see here, I read this from a skill parameter, so it can be changed. So if someone takes my skill and puts it to a digital assistant, they can change it from the outside. I have a base URL and then the target currency and the base currency. Now I have this guy in here because I like to use model-driven designs. So I have, for the conversation, a back item with 3 bags just to collect the information that I want to use. And because they are pointed to value list, I have it even easier. So I say convert money. And this then shows a list of values with the currencies that I want to support in my sample. So next step is, what is the amount to convert? And then I can go to US dollar. And now it calls the custom component. So we'll later explain why we will have to wait a few seconds here, which is down to the deployment path that I chose. So what the component is doing, it receives the information and then calls the REST service, and then it gives me not just the conversion rate, but also converts it. And then do you like another? Let's say yes. And now you see why I like model-driven conversations, because I can say I want it from euro. And to US dollar. You see that this is nicely caught up by the entity. And it's nice to see that they're so close together, because for a few weeks ago, it was a lot more expensive to exchange US dollar into euro. So that was this. So let me have a quick look at the sample code. So you should see my Visual Studio Code environment now. So what you see, what I have is I have properties defined in my metadata environment. So I see base currency, target currency, and I have to provide what type of information I'm passing, amount, and then the key. And those parameters will be passed in as I showed from the flow, and then I map them to constants within my code. And then all I need to do is just deal with it. So you see, like, convert a base URL query as I showed before. And here what I also do is I send back a message. Yeah, so I said, okay, today for basically the message that you see, I generated from the component. And so that I make the point, I'm not implementing it with best practice because I hard coded the strings, so that would make my custom components not available for multilingual use. So best practice always is to reference resource bundles, which you can. And there is a great topic that we have if you go to our documentation page, where you also find ARTI. There is a list of design camp sessions, and one is about resource bundles. So if you're interested in this topic, which is amazing, to be honest, then watch that video. So with this, let me go back to my slides to continue. So the next thing is entity event handler. And to me, well, exaggerating here, but I think entity event handler is the next best thing beside of sliced bread, honestly, because they're so powerful and in the way that they help you to build better composite back entities and better composite back conversations. So what it is, and I will have an animation on how it exactly works, it's an event-driven interaction between a composite back entity and your custom code. Yeah, so if there is a prompt to display, if you're interested in manipulating the prompt, you just create a function and that will get called in the context of resolving the composite back entity. So you'll always kind of be the man in the middle that controls everything. So composite back entities, I mentioned, they're real world objects like an order, like a product. I sometimes also use it as a controller. So if I know that I need a specific set of information without creating an object, I just use a composite back entity, because a composite back entity doesn't insist to be a real world object. It can be used for everything. So creativity without any boundaries here. So entity event handlers, they are optional for composite back entity. You create them as custom components, and I will show you how you create them. And then once they are registered with the composite back entity, you only have one entity event handler per composite back, though you can have event handler being reused between similar composite back if you want. But usually you have a one-to-one mapping between this. And if they're registered, then the component that renders the UI and that interacts with the user will make sure that the functions that you create in your custom component will be called. Again, the development environment is JavaScript with Node.js. And if we look at the events, I mentioned it's event driven. Of course, there are categories of events. So one is on the entity level. So the first time you start your composite back entity, there is an init function that will be called, and that will allow you, for instance, to call a REST service to provision the object. Yeah. So if it's an order object and you know the authenticated user, you definitely know the user ID, and every order will have an order ID. Sorry, you know the user, the user ID. So every order will have the customer or user ID to it. Yeah. So you can fetch that from remote and boom, provision it. So you don't have to ask the user for what's your customer number. Yeah. Validate. This is cross validation. So that's amazing. And that's kind of the difference between having a normal dialog flow and composite back entities, because if I have dependent information, yeah, for instance, if I buy a t-shirt, then it could be that based on a specific shirt, that specific sizes are not available. Now I can have this dependent validation. If someone says, ship me this t-shirt in that size, I can check and I say, okay, no, that's not available, in a very nice way, right? Well integrated. A publish message, this is where you interact with the prompt or the message that you want to display. At the end, when you leave the composite bag, say that it was an order, and I ask you about what product do you want to order, how many, provision the customer number, and so on and so on. At the end, when all of the information is there, I can use the resolve function to make a REST call to my backend service and just update the product database with the order, and then the shipment will happen automatically without you doing anything else. The item level, that means like you have control on every individual bag item. Now, one of the examples here is, and I think I have it on the slide, but I don't remember. So I say it here is like, if I have a bag item which is a date, yeah, then a date, even if it's valid, must not be a valid date. Think about an expense report. If I create a date of when that expense occurred and I put in a date in the future, then the date is correct, but the date being in the future is not correct. And this is what you can handle on item level events. So use cases for anti-event handler. Well, one, of course, is backend integration. That's why we're talking about it here. The other one is, and I mentioned this, custom validation. You see, like I have it on the slide, validate is not automatically a valid date. You can do cross-back validations, as I mentioned. You can even validate based on backend queries. Yeah, so if there is a specific discount to give on an order, I can do a backend query to see if the current authenticated user is entitled for that. You can create customized prompts, as you've seen in my demo with a currency converter for the custom components. It was a list of value that comes by default out of a composite bag entity. Now, what if I want to have a card layout? Now I can do that. I can override the default rendering of the UI. Then I can slot bag item values. So no matter where this is coming from, yeah, if there's any condition or any object I can access through JavaScript, if it's like saved in a variable, or if I do a REST call, I can slot items, the values of it, or I can compute those things. Yeah. And what I also can do is similar to a custom component, I can determine the next navigation target. So if, for instance, there's a specific condition, like someone says in the middle of creating an order, they say cancel. Now I can trigger that cancel transition out of the entity event handler. So as I said, it's a lot of power that you get out of this custom components. So let me just give you an idea how this all works, and after that you will make click and you will hopefully start loving entity event handlers. So first thing is that when a state is visited, and this component is like of a composite bag entity resolving state, then it will read the composite bag entity configuration, and with it the registered entity event handler. So then entity values are slotted, yeah. And then the next thing is that it says, okay, should the user be prompted? And everyone working with composite bag entities, you know that there's this property, prompt for value, that you can set to true or false, and based on the setting, it's hidden or shown. You can do the same in code. So you could have it just sending over to your entity event handler, and then the event handler executes some code and returns true or false. So if the component itself says, yes, it should be prompted, then it goes to your event handler. And if it has a should prompt function configured, then your event handler makes the final call on that one. Let's assume it says, yes, it's okay, render it. Then it will create the prompt So the component will create the prompt, which normally would be displayed. If, however, you have the prompt message function configured, then it will not immediately display the prompt, but first ask your event handler if the prompt should be displayed in that way. What can you use it for besides of changing the UI? You can have at any back item prompt, you can add a cancel button. So for people to exit the flow, right? So that's one thing that you can do. And then eventually you return the prompt and the component will display it. Similar, if the user provides input, first of all, the back item entity validation will happen. And now coming back to my example with the date, if a date is a date, that doesn't mean it's a valid date, because it could be a date in the past or in the future that you expect. Yeah, if you create a new meeting on a calendar, it should be a future date, not a past date. So the back item validates the date to be valid, and then it passes it on to the event handler, and the event handler can now execute whatever code and return true or false. And based on what it returns, it will continue. So let me go back here and make just one point. At any time within this back and forth, you can do backend calls. Yeah, so whenever there's a need for a backend call, you can do that. There are two development choices that we have. One is browser-based development, in which case it is within the Oracle Digital Assistant skill environment. It's easy to use, and it has a lot of assistance that allow you to create the functions. So it will provide you with documentation and comments that will explain what is passed into each function and how to work with that, beside of the documentation that we have available on GitHub, which I recommend you looking at. And at the end of the development, or even in between, you just hit a save button and it will do a deployment into Oracle Digital Assistant. So if you use browser-based development, then your entity event handler lives within the skill. And it if you create a version of the skill, it will go with that version as well. Yeah. With the JavaScript, with the external IDE, which I would consider an advanced option, probably everyone would start with a browser deployment until they're feeling, or development until they feel comfortable, and then you would see a benefit in using an external JavaScript IDE, because the support for JavaScript as a language, or TypeScript, and again here you could use TypeScript, is much better. Yeah, so you use the bots node SDK to create the component. I have slides on that. If you create entity event handler external, you need to package them and deploy them, similar to custom components. You have the ability, however, to source control them much better, because they are on the IDE. And if you use an IDE that supports Git, then you can, from your IDE, source control the event handler. Whereas if you have this sitting in the Oracle Digital Assistant environment, then it will be source controlled with the versions that you create for the skills. So for the browser-based development, you select the composite back entity. Here I have an expense item composite back entity. There's a little icon there that you press, and this will open up then the editor. And you see it's a JavaScript editor, not really rich, so to say. It's not a comparable to external IDE, but it's very helpful. And then you have, and that's the nicest thing of it, you have this add event button. And if you press this, then there's a dialog where you say, okay, I want to have an item level event, or I have an entity level event. And then it shows you, these are your back item names, for which item do you want to have it. You select one and it shows you exactly which of the functions doesn't exist. You click on it, it will create the skeleton and you start coding. If you use the external IDE, then there is a similar workflow as for the custom components. So again, you start with node and npm install. It's a one-time thing. So if you have it installed, you don't have to install it again. You create the project, similar as I said for the custom components. And the only difference is that when you create the init, so the first component, then you have an argument component type entity event handler. There's also a shortcut to it, which is just a -e, but I like it to be explicit, at least on my slides. So this will then create a project for entity event handler and create the entity event handler components. And the rest is all the same. So again, you have a language switch that allows you to change it from JavaScript to TypeScript. Same for the packaging and deployment, and same for the bots node SDK service. And again, similar to the other one, you can also create your component in subdirectories and give them a name of your choice. Instead of that you're renaming it in your IDE, you can just create it with a proper name up front. There's one nice thing about an external editor, and this is syntax completion. And what you do is there are two things that you need to do. One is that, and I put it here just as a code example, on top of the file, you put a constant entity resolution context and you point it to where this resolution context resides. And then on top of your function, in this case, it's a validate function, you put just these 2 lines of comments, and that will make sure, as I show in the image, that if you start typing context.get, it will show what's within the context. Yeah, and this makes it easy to figure out what are the functions that you can call. Because again, what you want to do is you want to call REST services, or you want to get a value from another back item. This is all through the bots node SDK. So back to the main topic, which is how do I do REST integration? And the good news here is it's the same, right? You use node fetch, which again, we recommend, but still, if you want to use Axios, even if you start in the browser, you can export the package, run npm install on it so that all the dependency will be loaded, and then you can run npm install Axios, and boom, you have Axios. You just need to bring it back then to the ODA environment. The REST calls itself are absolutely the same. It's an asynchronous call, and there's no need to leave the composite back entity, which is the most important point here, because that would allow you to use it from everywhere and for every event. So let me show you that. And switching here. So if you've seen us talking about entities, then you probably know about this here. So it's an expense system. So when I say, okay, create expense. So this is wired up to a composite back entity. What's the reason? The reason is a webinar. Then enter your ID. So, and this, by the way, now will have the entity event handler making a call to figure out that DE means I'm German, which in fact I am. Yeah. But with this, it will know what is the expense type. Am I on per diem, or am I on a daily rate? But it also knows what my home currency is, euro in my case. So I fire this one up. So event handler is doing the job. Now it asks me, though it could have detected that, but let's say I'm on actual expense. And then it goes through it. Again, I could have turned this into a carousel, but I didn't want to. So this is not handled by the ones. So let's do accommodation. Tell me about the expense. That's hotel. Don't want to do any advertising for any brand here. So this is why I put hotel. When did you make the purchase? Here's, if I say, what about November 2022? It's a valid date, right? But you see, time travel is unknown to me, which is why I insist to have a date that is in the past, because the use case demands a date in the past, and that's through entity event handler. So let's put a good one in. So June 12, 2020. Okay, and now it asks for what's the amount for the currency? What did I pay for my hotel? So I had a very cheap one. So let's 250 US. Or I think it's, is it asking for it? Yes, let's put this one in here. Okay. So you have recorded $250 US as an expense, which is converted to 248.38 euro. So what I'm doing here is that in the process of my expense reporting, I use node fetch to call out to the same currency converter that I used with the custom component that Daniel showed with the REST component. So in the context of validating something, I actually go and display or fetch the information and display it with the next prompt. So quickly, Here are my composite bag entities, one for expense items, one for the whole expense report. If I click here on that button, then you see that this is my entity event handler. Might look like a lot of code, where you see that most of it is just documentation and comments. And if I want to add another one, this is like what I have. So I have an expense category. I can validate the expense category just in case that someone provides an invalid value. And each of these events could use a REST service for backend integration. All right, so almost there. Best practices. So I think Daniel and I, we did drop some information already, like for custom component best practices to not make assumptions. Daniel said that try to configure. I forgot what he said, but he had a best practice. So maybe during the Q&A we can repeat that. But I do have some else as well. But before that, let me go through the deployment option, and that's also something that goes into best practice. This is why I made this little excursus to best practice. So we have 3 deployment options for custom components and for event handlers. One is a built-in container, and that means that you package your component and the event handler or a custom component, and you drag and drop this into the local skill. So it will then go into an internal Oracle functions deployment, and this actually will then live with the skill. The other option is to use an Oracle external function, and there is a property configuration setting for that. Here, the function will live in your tenant. It will not live in the Oracle tenant. It will live in your tenant, which means that you have full administrative control. You also have full control of the OCI services that you want to access. If you think about it, in an entity event handler or in a custom component, the backend integration could be a call to Oracle IE services to do sentiment detection or to do some sort of, there's one use case we did in a health example where you want to know if a question, for frequently asked question, if that is health related or if it's just about soccer. Now for the soccer, you don't want to answer it, but for health, you would go out to the internet and query that information. So this is something where you would use OCI services, or if you want to, or if you have to use passwords to do an action or a connectivity to the REST service, then you can save it in Oracle OCI Vault. The third one is an external container, and here you will use Kubernetes, so OKE, and that will also give you full access to OCI services. Full control. It has no limits in terms of how many components you can deploy. Plus, it has the option to deploy additional components like web views, which I mentioned. You could have single page applications for structured data input deployed into your digital assistant or in your skill. Now, this could also be deployed remotely as a web view. And if you have your own messenger, and we talk next time, we talk about messengers and channels and how do you interact with a messenger like WebView or a messenger like Facebook or MS Teams, Slack. So we talk about this next time. But if there's anything that you want to integrate Oracle Digital Assistant in that we don't have a native solution, webhooks would be the solution, and you can deploy to the external container. So there, all 3 have their reason to exist, and all 3 have their benefits. But they also have, as wherever good light casts some shadows, we do have shadows. So built-in container is no administrative access, and you have limits posed by the Oracle functions. And that is, you could have seen in the beginning when I run my custom component that I had to wait a few seconds, and that is because I had a cold start. Yeah, because once it's being used, that's like quick and fast. But if I'm the first ones using it, then it might have 20 seconds delay if I'm not lucky. Yeah, so there is a little bit of downside. Plus, there's a limit in the number of components I can have, and so on. For external functions, there's an additional OCI cost that you have because external function would be a service of OCI within your tenant. But the benefit here is like full access, full control, full OCI services. And again, the cost actually gets justified by the benefit you get. And you get a huge benefit out of using external functions compared to the embedded container. Embedded container is great. And I think that probably more customers use the embedded container than using some external solutions. But the more enterprise you think, the more external you go. And then there is Kubernetes or OKE, which give you the full flexibility and the full powers, unlimited, excellent performance. But again, that would have an additional cost because that will have then an OCI fee on top of that. So anyway, so there's nothing where we would say you have to use OKE for the deployment. It's just like the options that you have. So if you're happy with the embedded container, go with the embedded container. If you hit some of the limits or can't do what you want to do, then just go for it. And this now gets me to the registration page. So what you need to do with the custom component, you have to register it before you can use it. And there we have the options embedded container, Oracle Mobile Cloud, external, and Oracle Functions. Now, Oracle Mobile Cloud is a separate cloud service, which we didn't cover in detail in this session because mostly we either have customers using embedded container, external functions, or Oracle external Kubernetes containers in OCI or Oracle Functions, but Oracle Mobile Cloud as well as an option. If you use the embedded container, the package file, you just drag and drop it in. Don't forget to enable the component logging so that you can see the log messages that get written. And you give it a service name, and this service name is what, when you drag and drop a custom component template into your dialog flow, the first thing you select is like the service name for which you want to have that component, because you can configure as many as you want. So now we get to best practices, and these are more questions I will just ask and answer at the same time. So custom components or entity event handler was the best for backend integration. And well, if you followed along, then the answer is it depends on what you do and how you implement it. If you go for a model-driven approach where the composite back entity is driving the conversation, then of course every backend integration in response to this will be entity event handler. If, however, you can navigate in a dialog flow and then need to have a REST call, then you want to do this. Now, the benefit of having the REST call with a custom component or the REST component in a dialog flow is that, as I mentioned, you can have a subflow, and this subflow can be reused. So there's a high potential of reuse of code, whereas in an event handler, the REST call would live with that event handler. Of course, as a JavaScript developer, you know you can create your libraries and your node modules, yes, but mostly people don't do it. They just have the REST call in where they need it. Yeah, so that was kind of where they have limited reuse. So there's no clear yes or no to each of the approaches. It depends on where you need to have the REST call. Second, custom or built-in REST service component was the best for backend integration. Now, if you're in a dialog flow and if you can use the REST service component, then you go with that. The reason here is that it's declarative configured and it doesn't need you to write anything. So you don't have to maintain and code. But if there is a more complex use case, like 2 or 3 REST API calls that you need to do, then actually the custom component might be your choice. So if custom, where should I deploy to? Again, that's absolutely up to you. So you can use the embedded container. It's there. If you live with it and if that works for you well, and it for most of the customers it really does. But then if you need to have like access to the full OCI environment, probably then a deployment to external functions or Kubernetes makes more sense to just embrace the OCI functionality. Because as I mentioned in the beginning during the introduction, a digital assistant is a front end. Yeah, it's like the waiter in a restaurant. It's not the barman, it's not the cook, the chef in the kitchen. Yeah, so for whatever the order is that the waiter in the restaurant picks up, we'll give it to the backend, which is the kitchen or the bar, right? And similarly, look at OCI as your kitchen and bar, yeah, because it has integration layers and so on. So the more enterprise, the more likely we go to external services. So what's the best for REST service with large payload responses? So this slide is only there to tell you to avoid large responses, because the digital assistant, even if you access it from REST component, if you access it from custom component, or if you access it from event handler, it's not an integration layer. If you have the need to bring together a lot of payloads and combine them into a single payload, the same if you have to query a lot of data, make sure that you create an integration layer that you put on whatever middle layer you have. Most likely OCI Cloud makes a lot of sense here. Yeah. So instead of having 3 services to call, think about if you can combine this on the server side into 3. Another use case I had was I needed to generate PDF out of the content or the summary of a conversation. So I generated the PDF on the server side and made this available as a URL for download. Yeah, that made more sense than bringing down all of the information into the custom component and have ODA dealing with that. You can save a lot of data in variables, but the variable is not a database. So you need to make sure that you understand when it becomes clever to really use the middle tier or the cloud and OCI to save this kind of data, and as well to compute like the combination of REST payloads. And that's it. So that's, I think, what I had to cover and what Daniel had to cover. And I think we're now open for questions. We have plenty of time left. So if there are questions.
Yeah, there was a couple of them. One that you already answered. So the question was if we could use the REST service component to set a bag item. So I think that was clear that entity event handler is the approach for that. If you need to manage the composite bag and set values, that's the way you should go about it. So that one was answered. There's one open one. I'm leaving it for you. So the question is, so the old invocation, the conversation with Dan, will that be deprecated in the future?
Oh man, it depends on how long I should look forward. So there's no intention yet that we have to deprecate it. So I don't see a date for that yet. I would never say never, because, you know, in 10 years, I don't know what is there, but there's no immediate need we have for that, because it's just a signature, and the signature stays within the SDK. So there's no dependency to Digital Assistant, because Digital Assistant would just make the call to the custom component, and the custom component right now, or actually the SDK, has 2 signatures that it supports.
Yeah, I was leaving it for you because I was also not sure.
Yeah, I don't think that there is a need yet to be nervous. No, just keep on going.
I will pass back to Jürgen.
So to wrap it up, while we give you the opportunity to post more questions, there are several resources for customers and several ones for partners. You can visit the Oracle Digital Assistant website, make use of the documentation. It includes RT, our bot, and there are many samples also on the documentation page. Today's webcast will be published on Oracle Video Hub. If you have questions, you can post them on Cloud Customer Connect. And please subscribe to our quarterly newsletter with all the updates and upcoming events. For partners, we run a dedicated community where you receive the support on sales, marketing, and enablement. As a community member, you have access to our website, and please attend the upcoming hands-on trainings. So this is a webcast in a series of 6 webcasts. The next one will be on November 22nd. What will we cover, Daniel and Frank?
Well, as I mentioned, we would talk about a channel. So this is like, there was this famous quote in Java land, write once, run everywhere or anywhere. And this is like what it pretty much is about. It's having your bot being exposed on a channel. So what are the channels that we support natively? And what if you have a channel that you need to support that we don't have a native support? So how do you do that? Plus, how would you design for it? So what is like the design consideration to do so that you're not locking yourself in for a specific channel?
Wonderful. So please make sure you register and join us for November 22nd. Special thanks to the speaker team. Awesome job. Thank you, Frank and Daniel. That was again a wonderful session. And please join us for November 22nd webcast. In case you missed one of those, they're all recorded and available on demand, and they're there to help you to build better bots. Thank you for attending, and please complete this feedback form. Once you leave the Zoom webinar, the feedback form will pop off. Thank you very much. Thanks for attending.